A single camel did what an entire army could not do. In 1942, as 500,000 men were dying in the ruins of Stalingrad, a Bactrian camel named Kuznechik became the difference between survival and annihilation. Not through strength, not through weapons, through stubbornness, through the simple act of walking. This is how an animal became a hero. This is how a grasshopper changed the course of war. August 23, 1942. The German 6th Army surrounded Stalingrad. In that moment, 200,000 Soviet soldiers realized they were trapped. The city was cut off completely. No supplies could get in. No wounded could get out. The Volga River to the east was in German hands. The steppes to the west were held by German forces. The only way to supply the city was methods that had not been anticipated, methods that were not modern, methods that were, quite simply, forgotten. The Germans expected conventional warfare. They expected trucks bringing supplies down roads. They expected aircraft making cargo runs at night. They expected boats on the river. The Soviets had none of these options. Any truck attempting to enter the city would be destroyed by artillery. Any aircraft would be shot down by fighters. Any boat would be sunk. The Germans had closed every conventional supply route, and yet somehow supplies had to get in, because without supplies, the city would fall in days. Without ammunition, the soldiers could not fight. Without food, they would starve. Without hope, they would surrender. The mathematics was simple and brutal. 60,000 Soviet soldiers were dying per month. The official calculations showed that supplies would run out completely within 10 days. After that, there would be nothing. The city would fall. The war would be lost. What the Germans did not expect was what came from the Soviets next. They did not expect the solution to be biological. They did not expect it to be alive. They did not expect a camel. Let us go back further. Back to the steppes of Kazakhstan. Before the war, the Soviet Union had captured a Bactrian camel. Perhaps it had been wild. Perhaps it had belonged to someone. Perhaps it had been part of a traveling circus. History does not record the exact origin. But there was a camel in a Soviet depot somewhere in Central Asia. A camel that had survived the chaos of war. A camel that had somehow made it to the front. When the siege of Stalingrad began, when Soviet command realized they had a problem with no solution, someone asked a question. What if we used animals that the Germans have not accounted for? What if we use something that requires almost no food? What if we use something that does not announce itself with engine noise? What if we use something that cannot be tracked by radar or artillery spotters? What if we used a camel? The camel was brought to the front, to the 308th Rifle Division holding the northern sector of Stalingrad. A soldier named Dmitry Kozlov was assigned to care for it. Kozlov had grown up in Kazakhstan. He knew camels. He knew how they thought, how they moved, how they refused to cooperate unless they felt like cooperating. Camels are not horses. They are not obedient by nature. A camel will walk when it wants to walk and stop when it wants to stop. A camel will carry a load if it respects the person asking. And for some reason, Kuznechik respected Kozlov. The camel was named Kuznechik, grasshopper, because in Russian, Kuznechik means the insect that jumps. And this camel, despite its massive size, despite its burden, jumped over obstacles. It jumped over rubble. It jumped over destroyed buildings. It moved through the city like something from another world. Every day at dusk, Kozlov would load ammunition boxes onto Kuznechik's back. 40, 50, sometimes 60 pounds of explosives and shells. The camel would carry them through the ruins of Stalingrad, not on main streets, through underground passages when they existed, through alleyways between collapsed buildings, through areas where German snipers could not see clearly, through paths that no German scout would ever think to watch. Kuznechik moved quietly. A camel's footfalls are quiet. A camel does not announce itself. A camel simply walks. The sound of a camel walking is nothing like the sound of a truck engine. It is nothing like the sound of boots on pavement. It is almost silent, almost invisible. And so, every night, supplies moved through the city. Every night, ammunition reached soldiers who had none. Every night, food reached men who were starving. Every night, Hope moved through the darkness. The German commanders noticed something was happening. Supplies were getting into the city. Soviet soldiers were not starving as quickly as expected. Soviet ammunition was not running out as predicted. But the Germans could not figure out how. They watched for trucks. They set up checkpoints on every street. They watched for aircraft. They positioned anti-aircraft guns. They watched for boats. They placed artillery on the riverbanks. They did not watch for a camel. They did not imagine such a thing was possible. A camel, in the middle of a modern war, in the middle of the 20th century, carrying ammunition through a destroyed city. It seemed impossible. And yet it was happening. German intelligence reports became increasingly confused. Officers wrote memos asking how supplies were getting in. High command demanded answers. How were the Soviets maintaining their defense when all supply routes had been cut off? It made no sense. It was impossible, and yet it was occurring. Soldiers in the Soviet trenches began to notice the camel. They began to watch for him. They gave him a nickname. They called him the Savior. They called him the Ghost. They called him Grasshopper the Magnificent. When they saw Kuznechik coming, they knew supplies were arriving. When they saw the camel, morale improved slightly. In a siege where everything was dying, where everything was being destroyed, where everything was hopeless, a camel walking through the ruins seemed like an act of defiance. It seemed like proof that something still lived, something still moved, something still fought back. One soldier wrote in his diary that seeing the camel made him cry. He was not crying from sadness. He was crying because something that had seemed so ordinary before the war, an animal simply existing, had become an act of rebellion, had become an act of hope, had become proof that the war was not over, that surrender was not inevitable, that one more day of fighting was possible. The siege lasted from August 23rd to February 2nd, 163 days, nearly 6 months of continuous bombardment, nearly 6 months of hand-to-hand fighting in the ruins. Nearly 6 months of starvation and cold and death. The casualty figures were staggering. 200,000 German soldiers killed or wounded, 300,000 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded, over 1 million civilian deaths from starvation and cold. By the end, the city was completely destroyed. Buildings that had stood for a century were reduced to rubble. The streets were filled with bodies frozen solid in the brutal winter cold. The Volga River froze solid enough for trucks to drive across, and yet the city held. The Soviet defenders refused to surrender. They held on through impossible circumstances, and part of the reason they held on was because supplies kept coming. Part of the reason was because a camel kept walking. Part of the reason was because Dmitry Kozlov refused to give up. Kuznechik made supply runs every single day for months. Not every day was successful. Sometimes German fire would force a change of route. Sometimes the camel would be hit by shrapnel. Camels are tough animals. Kuznechik bore wounds that would have killed a horse. The camel would be patched up by Soviet medics and would go back out the next night. The medics would wrap bandages around the camel's legs where shrapnel had torn the skin. They would treat infections. They would do everything they could to keep the animal alive. Because they knew that the camel was more valuable than gold. The camel was more important than any weapon. The camel was their lifeline. Sometimes Kozlov would have to threaten the camel to get it to move. Camels are notoriously stubborn, but Kozlov knew how to handle them. He knew the camel would walk if he asked. He knew how to speak the language of camels, and the camel did, night after night, month after month, through the worst conditions imaginable. When the battle finally ended in February, Kuznechik was still there. The camel had survived the siege. The camel had survived months of bombardment and fire. The camel had become something more than an animal to the soldiers around him. He had become a symbol. He had become a companion. He had become a reason to believe that survival was possible. Soviet soldiers began to talk about Kuznechik with reverence. They began to tell stories. They began to preserve his memory. They spoke of him as if he were a saint. In the brutal chaos of war, a camel had become legendary. Officers wrote reports mentioning the camel's contribution. Soldiers passed around stories. Word spread through the Soviet army about the camel who saved Stalingrad. But something else happened too, something darker. After the war, The Soviet Union tried to erase Kuznechik from history. The official narrative was about heroic commanders and brave soldiers. There was no room for an animal in Soviet propaganda. There was no room for a camel in the glorification of the Red Army. Stalin's government wanted heroes who fit the narrative, heroes who were human, heroes who could be manipulated and controlled in the retelling. An animal did not fit. An animal could not be propaganda. So Kuznechik was forgotten. The story was suppressed. The soldiers who remembered him kept their memories private. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. But officially, Kuznechik did not exist. He had been erased from the record just as thoroughly as he had been removed from the city after the war ended. For decades, Kuznechik was gone, erased, forgotten, as if he had never been. It was not until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that historians began to recover the stories that had been suppressed. Researchers looked through old military records. They found references to animals being used for supply. They found mentions of a camel in Soviet division reports. They found photographs. They tracked down elderly veterans. They conducted interviews. Slowly, the story emerged again from the dust of history. An old woman whose father had fought at Stalingrad told the researchers about Kuznechik. She had heard the story from her father when she was a child. She had remembered it her entire life. She had waited decades to tell someone who would believe her. She described how her father spoke of the camel with tears in his eyes, how he said the animal had saved his life, how he said he had never forgotten the sound of the camel's footsteps in the darkness. And finally, someone did. Finally, the story was recorded. Finally, it was preserved. Today, Kuznechik is remembered primarily in the memories of survivors and their descendants. There is no monument to the camel in Stalingrad. There is no official recognition from the Russian government. But the story persists. The story survives. In Russian military culture, in the stories told by veterans, in the memories of families, Kuznechik lives on. The camel that saved a city. The animal that proved that victory sometimes comes not from the most advanced weapons or the most sophisticated strategy, but from stubborn persistence. From the willingness to keep walking when it would be easier to stop. From the simple choice to show up day after day and do what needs to be done. In 1942, when everything seemed impossible, when the city should have fallen, when surrender seemed inevitable, a camel named Kuznechik walked through the ruins of Stalingrad every night. He carried supplies, he carried hope, he carried the weight of an entire army on his back, not with words, not with weapons, simply by walking, simply by refusing to quit. And in doing so, he changed history, not in the way that generals change history, not in the way that weapons change history, but in the way that quiet persistence changes history, in the way that stubbornness changes history, in the way that an animal who simply keeps walking can change everything. August 23rd, 1942. That was the day the siege began. That was the day when a camel became part of one of the bloodiest battles in human history. That was the day when it became clear that heroism does not always wear a uniform, that heroism does not always come from humans, that sometimes heroism comes from an animal named Grasshopper who simply refused to stop walking. That is the story of Kuznechik. That is how a camel saved Stalingrad. That is how one animal proved that the smallest acts of persistence can change the course of war. But here is the real question, the question that matters. If Kuznechik could save an entire city by simply refusing to quit, what is stopping you? What impossible challenge in your own life could be overcome by stubbornness, by persistence, by the simple decision to keep walking, by the refusal to surrender? History is not just about what happened in the past. History teaches us how to live now, and Kuznechik teaches us that sometimes the smallest act of determination is enough. Sometimes all you need to do is keep moving. So here is what I want from you. In the comments below, tell me about a time when you refused to quit. Tell me about a moment when persistence changed everything. Tell me about your own Kuznechik moment. Because I believe that every person watching this has a story like that. Every person has faced a siege. Every person has felt surrounded. And every person has had to decide whether to keep walking or to stop. Share your story. Because your story matters. Because stories like that, ordinary stories of extraordinary people, are the real history of the world. And if you found this story as compelling as I did, if you believe that forgotten history deserves to be remembered, then subscribe. Because there are thousands of stories like Kuznechik's, stories that were erased, stories that were forgotten, stories that deserve to be told. New documentaries every week, new forgotten histories, new untold narratives. Subscribe now so you never miss a story that should have been remembered all along.